From the Lover's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lover Time. I'm Ariella Markowitz, filling in for David Sirota. The odds that you could end up on a terrorism watch list just went up. That's because last week, President Donald Trump issued NSPM-7, a national security presidential memorandum that flew mostly under the radar. The memorandum cites a surge in what Trump calls organized political violence as a reason to mobilize the 9/11-era Joint Terrorism Task Forces to investigate potential domestic terror in the U.S. But this new security memorandum claims that indicators of violence include anti-Christian or anti-capitalist values and even extreme views on gender. According to Trump, these are all characteristics of a sophisticated network of terror. So today I'm sitting down with Ken Klippenstein, the investigative reporter who first sounded the alarm about NSPM-7. I asked Ken to take us inside the details of the president's national security memorandum and what it means for the rest of us. Why aren't Democrats talking about the danger it poses to Trump's political opponents? And could this new anti-terrorism directive give Trump more power to silence peaceful dissent and expand police surveillance of American citizens? That's all coming up on today's show.
I told Pete we should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military.
Earlier this week, Donald Trump and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth addressed top military generals and other leaders at the Quantico Marine Corps base. Trump delivered his usual lament about America's crime-ridden cities.
The ones that are run by the radical left Democrats, what they've done to San Francisco, Chicago, they're very unsafe places.
Outlets like the New York Times and NPR focused in on the rambling, anti-woke tirade from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth.
No more identity months, DEI offices, dudes in dresses. We are done with that shit.
And let's not forget the fat shaming of the entire U.S. armed forces.
Frankly, it's tiring to look out at combat formations or really any formation and see fat troops. It's a bad look.
But amidst all the low BMI military fanfare, Trump said something that felt more ominous.
America is under invasion from within. We're under invasion from within. No different than a foreign enemy, but more difficult in many ways because they don't wear uniforms. At least when they're wearing a uniform, you can take them out.
Well, you can't say he wasn't candid. He talked about the enemy within, which I found sort of chilling and felt kind of like a direct-to-TV movie rendition of a president that is not up to much good. But it wasn't just rhetoric.
That's Ken Klippenstein, an independent journalist who's recently been covering misinformation surrounding political extremism. President Trump's comments during that speech seemed to directly allude to a document that Ken discovered on the White House website last week. A national security presidential memorandum that was ignored by mainstream news and even flew under the noses of legislators whose job it is to focus on national security.
Yeah, so it's called NSPM-7.
NSPM-7 stands for National Security Presidential Memorandum Number 7. The memorandum cites the assassination of Charlie Kirk, the attempted assassinations of President Donald Trump, Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, the recent shooting at a Dallas ICE facility, and even slain United Health CEO Brian Thompson as instances of domestic terrorism, quote, under the umbrella of anti-fascism and anti-American principles. Here's Ken again.
We have FBI Director Kash Patel testifying to Congress about a week or two ago, saying that there has been a 300% increase in the number of domestic terrorism cases that the Bureau has opened up since the beginning of the administration.
The memorandum strives to expand the executive branch's power to define who is plotting terrorism. It cites a handful of public spaces like chat rooms, schools, and social media as breeding grounds for Antifa and potential areas for surveillance.
So this is clearly a framework that the administration uses to look at what its job is, which is political adversaries engaging in violent conduct. That's terrorism by definition. And the FBI's approach generally, from Tesla vandalism, the FBI director and attorney general calling that terrorism, to whatever else they perceive as their political adversaries, just painting with this very broad brush, calling things terrorism that I don't think any reasonable assessment would see it as.
This idea of labeling so-called anti-Americanism as a threat to national security isn't novel, and it's making a comeback. Last year, the Heritage Foundation, the billionaire-funded organization behind Project 2025, published a document called Project Esther. Project Esther is a plan to dismantle the Palestine Solidarity movement in the U.S. The Heritage Foundation calls it a blueprint to counter anti-Semitism in the United States and ensure the security and prosperity of all Americans. Their recommendation? Reframe political dissent as an organized network of foreign-funded terror. Trump has already begun enacting some of Project Esther's suggestions, such as criminalizing pro-Palestinian activism on college campuses and detaining students who are critical of Israel. With this new memorandum, NSPM 7, Trump seems prepared to expand the strategy of Project Esther, but this time, he's targeting potential terrorists who he sees as part of a larger Antifa movement. The memorandum is less than 2,000 words, but it has far-reaching consequences. The Joint Terrorism Task Forces have been encouraged to investigate U.S. citizens with, quote, extreme views on immigration, race, and gender. It empowers the Secretary of Treasury and the IRS to, quote, disrupt financial networks of groups or individuals who show hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on religion. It's a lot to process, so I asked Ken Klippenstein to break it down for us.
Tell us a little bit about when this memorandum went out, what's in it, and what it entails.
Yeah, so it's called NSPM 7. That refers to the fact that it's the seventh such memorandum. This is not an executive order.
Yeah, what's the difference?
Yeah, part of what made me interested in this was how misreported it was. Even good outlets like C-SPAN were calling it, oh, here's another executive order. And I think because of that, it got tossed in this wastebasket of, oh, Trump's had 200 of these. Many of them are symbolic or theater. What does it mean? Well, it's not an executive order. It's much more significant than that. NSPM 7 stands for National Security Presidential Memorandum. And there are only 7 presidential memorandums. The previous one, NSPM 6, was classified. Many of them are secret. And so what it does that's more significant than the executive order is it's kind of like a strategy document. It's saying, here's our big picture goal. This is what we need to focus on and why we exist. What was interesting was he signed it into law last Thursday, and I didn't even write about it because at first I thought, wow, that's really crazy. There's no way that this is obviously going to get covered everywhere. So what's the point? I already had my hands full with doing reporting on the 2 mass shootings, the one in Utah and in Texas. So I didn't even write about it. I think until 2 days later when, to my dismay, I saw that nobody was, I don't think there was a single story in a mainstream outlet. And I thought about it. I realized, okay, well, people probably don't know what a presidential memoranda is and why that's so significant. And it seemed to me that nobody had read past the headline, because when you do that, the details were really bone chilling because they talk about treating political violence as terrorism. And when you have a counterterror investigation, it's essentially like pre-crime. You're trying to stop something before it happens. And in certain cases, like weapons of mass destruction, biological weapon, that might make sense. You might be willing to pursue something with the aggressiveness of a counterterror investigation because the event is so bad that you're willing to do what's necessary to prevent it. So when you're doing that, you have to monitor indicators of this future event since it hasn't happened yet, which is distinct from normal law enforcement where you look at a crime, you go investigate the crime, and then you charge the person. Since the crime hasn't happened, they got to predict it. So how do you predict it? You monitor speech. And in that memoranda, it lists a bunch of what they call indicators of potential future terrorism. And these indicators are so broad. Just to give you a few of them, one was like anti-Christianity, anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism. Yeah. And it occurred to me, it's like, this has got to describe like at least 10% of the country, right? And so I was just shocked by it. And again, the initial reaction, I've seen press kind of blow off Trump's decisions based, I think in large part on a lack of literacy on national security. So they say, you can't designate a domestic terror organization, only foreign terror organizations. So therefore, there's nothing to worry about. That's misleading. So legally, you can only charge someone on the foreign terrorist organization watch list. That doesn't mean the FBI doesn't maintain its own list of domestic terrorists, nor that they can investigate things as terrorism, even if the person isn't charged as that. You can collect evidence that you end up charging them with for something that is illegal to charge them with, that has nothing to do with terrorism, but you can investigate it as terrorism. So that's basically what made me interested. Is I thought, wow, people don't understand national security. I really have to provide some context here.
You wrote that this memorandum is the most important change in the expansion of government power since the Patriot Act. Why did this memorandum, and as you highlighted this incredibly broad definition of what could be a terrorist organization, ring alarms for you?
Yeah, I actually try to be cool-headed about things. Like I've written on the National Guard deployments and taken a middle position, which is sort of like, these things are corrosive to democratic culture. You don't want to have troops stomping around. That being said, they don't have authority to engage in law enforcement because of posse comitatus. So it's really limited what they can do. Posse comitatus is the prohibition on standing armies, the military, engaging in law enforcement domestically. This comes right out of the core of American history, and colonists obviously not being thrilled about the British Army enforcing laws in America. And so I've tried to say, okay, this is bad, but it's not like this military coup is happening. Let's be level-headed about this. And a lot of the ridiculous videos you've seen of them just standing around seeming to have nothing to do, it comes from the fact that they don't have authority because of the Constitution to do some of the, uglier things that we can imagine them doing. So it's not like I am just, I don't want to hit the panic button on everything that I see. But in this case, I thought it was warranted because when you tap counterterrorism authorities, like how that memorandum does, what it's doing is it's telling what's called the Joint Terrorism Task Forces. These were units established after 9/11, and they number I think 4,000 FBI agents and local law enforcement that have been put into these task forces. They're in every state, all 50 states in the US. And as with the National Guard, the president can federalize them. Even though they're law enforcement, the federal government can tell them what to do, but there's no posse comitatus. They can directly engage in law enforcement. And that's the big difference. What a lot of people have been afraid of about National Guard, these guys can actually do. They can actually go and police the streets of America on the orders of the president without even the knowledge or approval of the state governor or legislature. So what it does is it allows them to respond to all those indicators that I was just describing: anti-Christianity, anti-capitalism, it's a whole long, there's even more than that. So that in particular is what really scared me. And it goes back to the Patriot Act, goes back to 9/11, because that's when these groups were established. For the most part, they didn't exist before that. And it was supposed to be something that could respond to something on the order of 9/11. Again, something serious enough to warrant this pre-crime approach of preventing a crime before it's happened. And there's a phrase, I'm not overstating it. You can go and look at the memorandum. It says, prevent them before it happens. That's not an interpretation. That's, first of all, what counterterrorism is. But second of all, that's what the memorandum says. So all of that together, I find it extremely frightening that, a state authority can't actually stand up to these guys. All of this is out of our hand. This is something the president can just control directly. So it's really frightening in a way that I think that even some of the more outrageous things like the Guard deployments to Portland, for instance, don't reach.
In your reporting, you highlighted that right now there's currently about 5,000 people in the USA on an FBI watch list for domestic terrorism. And a source told you that number could double. What kind of entities could potentially now be targeted by the Trump administration for harboring these quote unquote radical views? Yeah,
so like I said, the really frightening thing, and the reason counterterrorism is its own category that is one you're supposed to kind of debate and be like, okay, does the threat justify or necessitate this kind of response, is because it's understood that the way in which you investigate a counterterrorism infringes on civil liberties. You're recruiting informants, as we did after 9/11 in mosques, to try to tell people. You're going and having people pose as somebody pretending to sell, say, nuclear fissile material, so that you can basically entrap people. And the justification in those cases is, okay, well, if someone's trying to make a dirty bomb, that's so horrifying that it's worth, I think Dick Cheney described it as entering into the shadows and doing some of these things that you might otherwise feel uncomfortable with because the possibility is so dangerous. But if you look at like vandalizing Teslas, does that really... I think any reasonable person would look at that and say, no, that can be prosecuted like any ordinary crime. You don't need to be spying on people. You don't need to be recruiting informants in groups, having undercover officers pretending to sell them, material to attack the Teslas with and essentially entrapping people. I don't think any of that is justified for that kind of a crime, in which I think to date, nobody's been killed and it's just been property damage. But they have a whole long list of these things. I mean, anti-Americanism, I don't even know what that means. And so it's like, yeah, and I just did a story talking about law firms now that are counseling their clients, which are businesses and nonprofits, saying, hey guys, you've got to watch the language you're using. So it's going to have a chilling effect on speech. Already is, because these law firms are advising their clients to behave differently. And the effect is going to be, all right, well, we better tighten up around what we say on X, Y, and Z. That's the immediate effect of this.
Let's get into that, because some of these law firms you've reported on are these, corporate law firms in DC Arnold and Porter, Wilmer Hale. Why do you think they're sounding the alarms to their clients before it trickles down to the rest of us? I know they're also raising the alarm for nonprofits in particular. Why does this affect these more progressive nonprofits and Trump's ability to go after them?
The memorandum frames it as radical left, I think is the phrase they use, radical left-wing extremism or whatever. When you look at the lawyers who are being paid to tell their clients how to minimize risk, like their job is to assess these things accurately. So I think it means something when they're telling their clients to adopt different behavior. If you look at the document, it's careful to say radical, blah, blah, blah. But in the case of one of these law firms, these are, mainstream law firms. This is not like the National Lawyers Guild or some effort that's outside of the mainstream. They're basically saying, one of them said literally, this applies to progressive organizations, which means the mainstream of America, not the, I don't know what you would call it, Antifa or however, the Trump administration has tried to phrase it. So on the one hand, that is what they're telling their clients, and, they have a duty to represent their client to, their best interests. But in addition to that, there's this very weird disjunct where Congress had said almost literally nothing. At the time that I wrote that story, I don't think a single member of Congress had said anything about it. And so I went out to all the ranking members, the Democrats that were in leadership positions on the different national security committees, who are tasked with overseeing these things and holding the federal government, the executive branch in check. And not a single one of them had even put out a boilerplate kind of, this is bad and more of Trump's badness, or whatever you would have expected. I would have expected just ChatGPT level, not good. Even if they don't understand the legal nuance or national security nuances. Nobody had said anything. I went to them. One member responded to me at the time that I published, and that was Congressman Benny Thompson, who's the ranking member on the Homeland Security Committee. On the one hand, the legal companies that have to minimize exposure of these, multi-million-dollar firms and nonprofits, they're responding very quickly. I mean, they had this stuff up within a day because they understand my client is on the hook. But when it comes to any ordinary person, it's very frustrating. Not only does Congress not going to say anything about it, when I went and looked at the statements, virtually every one of them had these long, flowery remarks about the former FBI director, James Comey, being indicted. But it's like, what about the rest of us? How does what's happening to Comey affect me or any ordinary person? It affects Comey. I guess it affects us in some abstract sense of the problems with the democracy, but it's like, he's rich. He was the FBI director. He's going to have the best representation in court. I'm not particularly worried about him. I'm worried about ordinary people, protesters that are going to be charged with things, and they haven't said anything. Just today, I looked and I thought, I wonder if after this article blew up, maybe they're coming around. And Courthouse News, I think, interviewed Senator Alyssa Slotkin, the senator from Langley, who can't stop talking about her CIA experience and her national security expertise. She's from Michigan. And they asked her, she said, oh, I haven't read it. She had no comment on it. And she's on the Homeland Security Committee. It's literally their job to be overseeing this exact type of thing. It's shocking.
Do you think this is all deliberate?
No, I don't. I think it's the fact that they rely on the New York Times and cable news and, Washington press for their information. So they're in an information bubble. For them to intentionally ignore it would be crazy, because this is literally targeting some of the NGOs and advocacy groups that benefit them. And they're happy to talk about all kinds of other crazy things Trump says, many of which don't actually lead to anything. To give you just one example, this meeting in Quantico, Virginia, of all the military leaders, how many stories do we read about how, is this the beginning of a purge? Is there going to be a coup? They were all hand-wringing, I think far beyond what was justified. I made a few phone calls initially, and what I heard very quickly from senior people in the Pentagon was, this is an idiotic theater exercise where they're going to say, look how tough we are, look how great we are. And it seems like that's basically what it was. But every cable channel was freaking out. Politicians were all making statements about this thing that ended up being a total nothing burger. So they're happy to raise the alarm about things, including about national security relating things. I think they're just in such a cocoon of corporate media that they don't even hear about things if they don't talk about it.
After the break, I'm asking Ken Klippenstein if this new national security memorandum could open the door for independent journalists to be accused of domestic terrorism. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Lover Time. I'm sitting down with Ken Klippenstein.
You have a lot of sources working for the U.S. government. Are your sources afraid? Are you afraid as an independent journalist?
No, I mean, even in the case of NSPM 7, this authorizes some scary stuff. I worry about my sources more than anything. I don't want the government watching who I'm talking to because I'm worried about them. They're taking much more risk than I am by talking to me, because many of them aren't supposed to talk to media. I would say that, ultimately whatever evidence they collect, it's going to have to stand up in court. It's not like the Trump administration has been able to just vitiate the fact that you need to get a jury of your peers to agree with something. So that's an important check. And I think a reason that people shouldn't feel despair. I mean, they're going to have to reorient and restructure the whole national security system around these new priorities that he's promulgated in the memorandum last week. So there's plenty of time to do something to stop this. It's going to be something I'm sure they'll be working on for the entirety of their administration to try to change. So my hope is that people will get informed and involved and decide what they think and then press their demands before we've reached that point that there's some kind of culmination. Fortunately, I don't think we're there yet. When I talk to people in government, what I see is a lot of frustration. They're kind of like very sincere constitutionalists, and they don't like that things are happening that go against the spirit of it. But yeah, we shouldn't be less scared than they are, because I mean, think about what could happen if they got found out talking to me, and they're not scared. And they're more just like, why is Congress not talking about this? Why is the public not engaged in this? That seems to be their reaction.
You reported that the law firm Kaplan and Drysdale, known for its political law practice, comparing this new memorandum to FARA, which is the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Why don't you just break it down and tell us why they made that connection? I
mean, the memorandum has so many consequences. You really have to look to the legal side to even get a sense of it. But one of them was that this law firm that specializes in FARA enforcement said that it, quote, brought it back from the dead. And basically, it's a kind of controversial and squishy law in a lot of ways, because again, it's touching on speech stuff that gets to the First Amendment, and so it makes it hard to formalize. And historically, it's made it unpopular to enforce, because what it requires you to do is you have to register if you're acting, quote, on the behalf of not just a foreign government, but even just a foreign principal is the word they use. And so it's like, well, what does that mean? So for instance, say you want to visit Gaza and do a news story on it, and you speak to some Gazans. They're like, please get a story about this humanitarian issue we're facing. Is that FARA? Well, in a sense, because you talk to them and they ask you to do something. I mean, you're not doing it because they said it, but they did convince you that it was a worthy cause or whatever. So it's like it caused all these problems. And one can imagine the ways in which the Trump administration is going to implement those. I would guess that they're going to be the types of things that, again, these progressive groups and their phrase radical left are interested in. So that's part of the reason that it's been so lightly enforced in the past, is because it's a janky law that is controversial in nature. It was much more of a thing, I think, during the Cold War.
Mm-hmm. Playing the devil's advocate for a moment, you've raised some very significant concerns about this memorandum. But to what extent do you think it's an empty threat, potentially, to stoke fear?
Well, I would say you don't want to think of this as a binary thing, because I just gave you some examples of how it's already having an effect in terms of what nonprofits are being told to do, what they're going to go ahead and do. You mentioned FARA, that's going to have an effect on people's conduct related to foreigners. So it's a continuum of how it's going to be enforced. And I think that the early signs are that they really are going to push ahead with this, because again, they have that 4,000 to 5,000 person joint terrorism task force in every state across the country. They don't have to make anything. That system already sits there, already exists, and can be activated at any time. And I think just yesterday, last night, Attorney General Pam Bondi issued a directive, I think that was about creating like a Protect ICE task force or something, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. And it went on about how, there's been 1,000% increase in attacks on ICE. We need to defend them. And throughout the document, the first citation and throughout it was linking back to, pursuant to the Trump memorandum. So it's already being used. I don't think there's any question. It's just, to what extent are they going to activate these thousands of JTTFs across the country? I think that's the question that remains to be seen. And I think it would make sense for them from their perspective to do so, because like I said, it doesn't bump into the same legal problems that the National Guard and use of the military does, because they don't have that posse comitatus. If they're already willing to use the military, I don't see why they wouldn't use this in response to something. And they have sent federal assets to Los Angeles, Chicago. This would just be an expansion of that practice that's already ongoing to include the JTTFs.
I kind of want to pivot back to this idea of the war from within. You've done really fascinating reporting about the kind of ideological profiles of Charlie Kirk's shooter or killer, Tyler Robinson. And we're seeing the Trump administration weaponize crime, this idea of crime fighting, and now like radical leftism as an excuse to invade cities. So I'm curious, what is your actual reporting about extremism and the political beliefs of these political assassins? How does that conflict or work with this narrative that the Trump administration is saying about radical violent leftism out in the streets of America?
Yeah, my approach has been just to track down friends of the alleged shooters and just let them talk. And I don't come to them from any angle and say, oh, did he say anything about this guy? At least not, in the first part of our conversation, because I want to leave it open-ended and see what they say. And what I found, it was almost uncanny, the parallel between the alleged shooter, Tyler Robinson of Charlie Kirk in Utah, and then the now deceased shooter in Texas of ICE facility ended up killing a ICE detainee and injuring 2 others. Joshua John, in both cases, their friends were like, what do you mean? Politics? They're not political. And that was part of their motive in talking to me, is they were just surprised by the coverage. They thought, this isn't anything like the person that I knew. This story is wrong. Why are they saying this? And so I should say it didn't just conflict with the Trump administration. It conflicted with, a lot of stuff I saw from the left on social media where they were saying, oh, this person must be, in the case of Tyler Robinson, there were people claiming early on that, oh, he must be a, adherent of Nick Fuentes and he must be some right-wing guy or whatever. Cause whatever reason. I found zero evidence for that. I didn't see really any evidence for that initially. So I think there's this kind of mad dash to just be like, oh, he's on the other side or whatever, completely divorced from facts or even attempts to find them. The only stories I would see would be like, I kept seeing the Trump administration say in the case of Robinson, let's talk about that one first. They would say, oh, the family told us that he was a left-wing guy or whatever. And I kind of laughed at that because I thought, if you asked my mom what I thought, she would be like, he's a crazy communist or something, like something that I'm not, because it's through her lens and the way she sees the world. So it's like, you probably wouldn't get an accurate picture from people's parents, even if they're trying to say it, because they just see the world differently. So I try to talk to the friends. And it wasn't that it was left or right. It was that they were pretty apolitical. In the case of Robinson, he did feel strongly about LGBT issues. He was described to me as bi, dating a trans person, and did take issue with Charlie Kirk's comments on transgenderism. Kirk, has said things like transgenderism is mental illness, stuff that clearly upset Robinson. But to take that and then say, oh, he's a progressive left Antifa, that is just a jump that is not sustained by the facts at all. I mean, he felt strongly about one thing and then that was it. And that and I really tried to find things. I wasn't trying to come from a certain perspective. I went to people in his Discord chats, which are like mainstream media has put all this mystique around it. Like, oh, Discord, like this secretive, it's basically WhatsApp for gaming. It's like you can do phone calls, text messages, video. And it's just like a server around whatever the chat room people that you invited in. I don't see where the mystique comes from. I guess that people over 50 maybe aren't on it the same rate that people under 30 are. But this is something that has hundreds of millions of active users each month. I mean, this is basically as mainstream as Twitter or any of these other social media platforms. But it's just that people of a certain age, I mean, I guess I don't use it. I'm in my 30s. But yeah, I asked people in those chat messages with Robinson, and there were multiple of them. Again, the media reported as though there was just one, and that's not the case. There were multiple of them. I tasked them. I said, go and search for Trump, search for Biden. I try to think of what's an objective way we can pull together empirical evidence for whatever the views are. One post on Trump the entire time, and it was like something about the impeachment in 2019, like 5 years ago. And then there was one post on Biden, which was about the election. Makes sense. Elections are when people pay attention and then they check out again, for the most part. But I was a little bit shocked by how much media tried to just project onto them political dynamic that exists in Washington and New York City, where a lot of these media companies are based, I guess, but which doesn't describe the majority of the country. My takeaway from this was the most normal thing about these two shooters was the fact that they were generally apolitical.
We're going to take one more quick break. Coming up next, I'm asking Ken Klippenstein if NSPM 7 will give the federal government the power to bypass First Amendment rights to fight alleged violent extremism. Welcome back to Lever Time.
We've kind of gotten into how these acts of violence have been politicized in the name of crime fighting and terrorism fighting. To what extent do you think it's also an attack on free speech? And what are the very real ways the federal government can now weaponize people's First Amendment rights and basically go after organizations they don't agree with?
Well, I described some of them, which is recruiting informants, having undercover agents act like, say, oh, do you want to go and shoot some commentator? Here, buy this gun. And then that leads into entrapment and questions of, would that have happened if you hadn't made it possible for that to happen? And it's just something I've seen already is it leads to paranoia. There are people saying, oh, you're a Fed, that kind of thing. All of this has a chilling effect on speech. So it's not like the government saying you can't say something, but it makes people paranoid and less likely to want to express their views because they're worried that it's going to get swept up or maybe they'll get in trouble. That is a major concern and a sort of subtle one. Another instance of chilled speech I described earlier, when nonprofits and NGOs are going to be like, well, okay, we want to do this edgy project. Maybe we won't do it because we're worried about our tax status. Mm-hmm. And that is something else that's already happening according to these law firms that are advising these companies. I would encourage people to read the memorandum. It's about 2 or 3 pages long. It talks about how the Treasury Department is also going to be creating suspicious activity reports around these things. Since there's no criminal predicate, since no crime necessarily has been committed, you've got to look to clues. Yeah. You have to become someone who's reading the tea leaves or whatever. And that means you're looking at association, you're looking at speech, you're looking at behavior that doesn't qualify as criminal nature. And that should be a concern to everyone. And the admin, to my amazement, has been pretty open about this. I mean, you have Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, coming out and saying, yeah, freedom of speech, we need to actually worry about hate speech. And then Trump was asked about Kirk, who was, some reporter said, oh, Kirk was a proponent of free speech. Don't you support that? And Trump says, well, I don't think he would be today. So they're just openly saying this. You don't even have to read the memorandum. They're pretty much saying they've had a shift on their views about free expression and free speech. But again, this is about Americans now rather than Al-Qaeda or ISIS or some of these foreign groups that you typically think of as the targets of the global war on terror, which is a point in itself. The global war on terror is coming to a close and the war, it feels, is coming home in some ways. Yeah. Because ISIS and Al-Qaeda are not the focus of this huge counterterrorism machine, which has never been disbanded. And now they're just going to, it sounds like, set them on domestic targets.
I would love to hear you talk just a little bit about solutions and where this might be heading. In your perception, where do you think the resistance to this is going to be coming from?
Well, I think one of the great lies is the idea that Democrats don't have a majority in Congress. What can they do? And it's I don't know what could be more of a rebuttal to that idea than the last year and all of these things that Trump has been doing with the executive orders that you couldn't dream of a Democrat doing, certainly in my lifetime anyways. And so I would interrogate that question of what can you do, as though the only power an elected official has is notching a ballot on a vote. That is just pure cynicism. And there's such a thing as public opinion and the bully pulpit, engaging people. I mean, when I look at the opposition party, I don't think he was talking about the left. It sounds like he's just talking about the Democrats generally. I don't see any effort. I pay very close attention to their media hits, hardly do any interviews. Meanwhile, Trump and the administration are on every cracked out podcast, an obscure show, wherever it is. They do all these shows and, sometimes they have flubs and things, but they don't care. And they power through it and they're reaching millions and millions and millions of people. I pay close attention to the leadership elements like Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries. Schumer went 3 or 4 months without doing a single television interview or sit down interview. These guys are not even trying. So to say, oh, what can you do? There's a whole gulf between what exists now that they're doing, which is, in the case of all of Congress, not even reading this freaking memo and being able to cast a majority vote. I mean, it's you try to shift opinion, which is what Trump did on immigration. He spent the last 4 years going around and talking about immigration. And guess what happened? The public's opinion changed on the issue. How did he do that? He didn't have a vote when he was out of office, when he was getting indicted, when he was facing, all these felonies. He didn't think, oh, what can I do? I don't have the power to vote. He knows that you can go and talk to people and change people's views on things. That's where real power is. And until Washington elected officials realize that, they're not going to take advantage of it. And it's not just some sentiment. I think the Republicans are making it very clear what the Congress can do if they choose to go ahead and use power. You've even seen some examples of this with Schumer. I saw Schumer at one point, he was like, I'm going to use this strange parliamentary maneuver to try to get some I don't know Congress very well, to be honest, but it was clear that they have these tools that they don't want to use, but suddenly they pop up when it's expedient to do so, So that's basically what I would say.
No, it reminds me of I believe Andrew Breitbart quote, that those who control culture control politics.
No, public opinion is very powerful.
Seems to ring true.
Yeah. And you can't act like it's written in stone. If Trump had thought that, public opinion wouldn't have shifted on immigration at all. You could go back 3 years, as recently as 3 or 4 years. Opinion was completely flipped on it. All this stuff would have been completely verboten. And it's coming back around to that now, this shift in opinion. But he completely changed it. And that's a very strong, I think, illustration of what can be done if you bother to talk to people.
What message would you have to whoever's listening to this now What do you think they should be most kind of aware of or activated about?
This stuff is not complicated to understand. I did my best to give people a kind of lay understanding of what it means. And again, just talk about it. Just talk about it. Like, I'm sure someone listening to this has some social media presence. And I know staffers on the Hill, their bosses are worried about if something starts moving on social media, am I going to get blamed for it? The more noise you make, you don't even have to organize a strategy or anything. If you just make noise, they're going to see it and they're going to feel the heat.
Ken Klippenstein is an independent journalist. You can follow his work at kenklippenstein.com. Thank you for your amazing work and shedding light on this.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. Lever Time is a production of The Lever. This episode was produced by me, Ariella Markowitz, and Natalie Bettendorf. It was edited and mixed by Ron Doyle. Our theme music is by Nick Campbell. You can subscribe to Lever Time on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, the PRX mobile app, or wherever you get your podcasts. For ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, and access to The Lever's entire archive of investigative journalism, head over to levernews.com to learn more about becoming a paid subscriber, or click the link in the episode's show notes. I'm Ariella Markowitz. We'll be back next week with another episode of Lever Time.